Imagine the throne of ancient Egypt, the most powerful seat in the known world, a place guarded by tradition, by priests, by generals, by men who believed power belonged to them alone. Now imagine a woman stepping into that world, not as a queen beside a king, not as a temporary figure waiting to hand power to someone else, but as ruler, absolute ruler, Pharaoh, and not just surviving, but thriving, building, expanding, outshining many of the kings who came before her. Her name was Hatshepsut, and for a time she ruled Egypt better than most men ever did. In the history of ancient Egypt, the stories people remember are often loud: conquerors, warriors, tombs filled with gold, names carved beside victory. But Hatshepsut's story is different. Her greatness was not built only on blood or battle. It was built on intelligence, patience, spectacle, and a level of political skill that made one of the most rigid kingdoms on earth accept something it was never meant to accept. Because Egypt did not expect a woman to become king. A queen could hold influence. A royal woman could guide a child ruler. A princess could preserve a bloodline. But the title of Pharaoh was something else. Pharaoh was not simply a monarch. Pharaoh was the living bridge between gods and men, the one who kept order in the world, the one who fed the temples, commanded the armies, and upheld Ma'at, the sacred balance of the universe itself. This role was wrapped in ritual, in masculine symbols, in centuries of tradition. And yet, against all of that weight, Hatshepsut rose. To understand how shocking that was, you have to begin with the world she was born into. Egypt in the early 18th dynasty was not weak. It was rising. This was the age when the kingdom was becoming an empire. The old wounds of foreign rule were still remembered. The Hyksos had once dominated northern Egypt, and the rulers who drove them out had transformed war into state policy. Expansion brought wealth. Wealth brought monuments. Monuments brought legitimacy. Royal power was everything. Hatshepsut was born into that power. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, a formidable king and military leader, and Queen Ahmose, whose royal blood gave weight to the dynasty. From the beginning, Hatshepsut was not an ordinary royal child. She grew up inside the machinery of kingship. She watched ritual. She understood court politics. She saw how authority was displayed, how memory was shaped, how divine approval was performed in public and carved forever in stone. She also grew up in a world where bloodline mattered, but not always in simple ways. Royal families in Egypt were both sacred and strategic. Marriages were political instruments. In time, Hatshepsut married her half-brother, Thutmose II, the man who became king after their father. It was a familiar pattern in Egyptian royalty, meant to strengthen dynastic legitimacy, and at first, nothing about her future seemed impossible to predict. She would be queen. Important, yes. Powerful, perhaps, but still operating within a role the kingdom recognized. Then history opened a door. Thutmose II died earlier than expected. He left behind a son, Thutmose III, but the boy was still a child, and more importantly, he was not Hatshepsut's son. He was born to a secondary wife. That detail mattered. In dynastic politics, every drop of status counted. And now, in the dangerous moment between one reign and another, Hatshepsut stood in a position unlike anyone else. She was the widow of the dead king. She was the daughter of an earlier king. She was a royal woman of exceptional rank, and the new heir was too young to rule alone. At first, the solution seemed normal. Hatshepsut became regent for the child king. That was understandable, even traditional. A powerful royal woman protecting the throne until the boy came of age. No one had to pretend the old rules were broken. The kingdom could reassure itself that this was temporary. But temporary arrangements can become something more when the person inside them is ambitious enough, patient enough, and brilliant enough to understand timing. For a while, Hatshepsut ruled in the boy's name. Publicly, the system remained intact. Officially, Thutmose III was king. But beneath the surface, Hatshepsut's position was growing. She controlled access. She directed court ceremony. She managed the machinery of state. Every decree, every offering, every act of royal presence passed through her world. She was not standing near power. She was exercising it. And then, step by step, she crossed the line, not in one reckless move, not in a sudden coup splashed with obvious violence. Hatshepsut moved with care. First, her titles expanded. Then her imagery changed. Then the language around her shifted. She began to present herself not just as queen or regent, but as king. Eventually, she took the full royal titulary, the formal set of pharaonic names that linked a ruler to divine authority and the long chain of Egyptian kingship. This was extraordinary. It was not enough for her to be powerful in practice. She wanted power in ritual, in law, in memory, power that could not easily be dismissed as temporary or unofficial. She wanted the throne itself, and she understood something many rulers never do. If you want people to accept the impossible, do not force them to stare at the impossibility. Wrap it in religion, wrap it in tradition, wrap it in symbols they already fear and obey. So Hatshepsut built an argument for her rule that reached beyond politics. She claimed divine sanction. In temple scenes, the god Amun himself was shown as the true father of Hatshepsut, visiting her mother in divine form and choosing her before birth for kingship. This was not a private belief whispered in a shrine. It was public theology, carved in stone, displayed in sacred places, repeated until it became part of the state's official memory. She was not saying, "I took power." She was saying, "The gods gave it to me." That difference mattered. In a kingdom where religion and government were inseparable, divine election was more than propaganda. It was a shield. If Amun had chosen her, then opposing Hatshepsut was not just political resistance. It was disorder. It was defiance of sacred will. It was an attack on Ma'at itself. And still, symbolism alone was not enough. The office of pharaoh had an image, and that image was male. The body of the king was represented through specific signs: the kilt, the royal headdress, the false beard, the broad chest, the stance of command. Hatshepsut did something fascinating. She did not try to destroy those symbols. She adopted them. In many statues and reliefs, she appears in male royal form. Not because she suddenly believed she was literally male, but because the visual language of kingship demanded it. In some depictions, traces of her female identity remain. In others, the transformation is more complete. It is one of the most striking acts of political theater in the ancient world. Hatshepsut understood that power is not only held, it is seen. And if Egypt expected a king to look a certain way, she would appear in that form until the mind of the kingdom learned to follow what the eye was being taught. It worked. That is what makes her reign so remarkable. Not just that she seized authority, but that she stabilized it. Egypt did not collapse into chaos. The temples did not shut their doors. The empire did not shatter in civil war. Instead, under Hatshepsut, the state grew wealthier, grander, more confident. The impossible became normal because she made it useful, and usefulness is often stronger than ideology. If a ruler keeps the grain moving, the temples funded, the elite rewarded, and the gods publicly honored, resistance becomes harder to sustain. People may whisper, priests may hesitate, courtiers may calculate. But if the kingdom prospers, the argument against the ruler weakens with every successful season. Hatshepsut knew this, and she ruled accordingly. Her reign was marked by one of the most impressive building programs Egypt had seen in generations. Across the land, monuments rose. Obelisks pierced the sky. Temples were restored, expanded, beautified. She did what great pharaohs were expected to do. She made Egypt visible to itself. Monumental architecture was never only about beauty. It was proof that the gods favored the ruler, proof that labor could be commanded, proof that memory was being shaped on a scale ordinary people could barely comprehend. And above all her monuments, one stands apart, the terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. Even now, it feels almost unreal. Set against the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, it rises in elegant levels, balanced, precise, and commanding. It does not look like a desperate gamble. It looks like confidence made stone. Colonnades stretch in measured lines. Ramps rise with ceremonial dignity. The mountain itself seems to lean over it like a witness. It is one of the architectural masterpieces of ancient Egypt. And it was part tomb, part political statement, part sacred theater. Every element spoke. This was not the work of a weak placeholder. This was the work of a ruler announcing permanence. At Deir el-Bahri, Hatshepsut's story was carved into walls for future generations to see. The divine birth narrative, the legitimacy of her rule, her relationship with Amun, her achievements. The temple was not merely built to honor her after death. It was built to define her while she lived. Stone became script. Architecture became argument. And there was another achievement that helped make her reign legendary: the expedition to Punt. For centuries, Punt had shimmered at the edges of Egyptian imagination. A place of incense, exotic goods, rare woods, ivory, gold, animal skins, and living wonders from lands beyond the usual horizon. Exactly where Punt was is still debated, but to the Egyptians it represented wealth, distance, and prestige. Reaching it mattered. Profiting from it mattered even more. Hatshepsut did not simply boast about foreign glory. She organized an expedition there, and then immortalized it in vivid detail. The reliefs at her temple show ships sailing south, goods being loaded, envoys arriving, strange trees being transported back to Egypt, and the local rulers of Punt receiving the Egyptians. This was not the image of a passive female ruler hiding behind palace walls. This was the image of command, of international reach, of abundance flowing into Egypt because the king, Hatshepsut, had opened the route. And that detail is crucial. Her greatness was not built mainly on battlefield conquest. It was built on statecraft, on trade, on display, on managing prosperity so effectively that her reign looked blessed. That does not mean Egypt under Hatshepsut was weak militarily. The empire still had armies. The memory of conquest still mattered. Military actions likely took place on the frontiers during her reign, especially in Nubia and perhaps in the Levant. But Hatshepsut's image was not centered on endless war. Instead, she projected control, stability, divine order, splendor. In some ways, that made her rule even more sophisticated. She understood that an empire does not live by victory alone. It lives by administration, logistics, ritual, and the constant performance of legitimacy. And she had help in carrying all of this out. No ruler governs alone, and one of the most intriguing figures of her reign is Senenmut, an official of humble origin who rose to astonishing prominence under Hatshepsut. He held many titles, oversaw projects, and appears closely associated with the royal household, especially with Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferura. His career has sparked endless debate. Was he simply a loyal administrator of exceptional talent, a political architect behind some of her greatest works, something more intimate? The truth remains uncertain, and uncertainty has a way of attracting legend. What is clear is that Hatshepsut knew how to use capable people. Whether noble-born or not, those who could strengthen her reign were valuable. That, too, marks her as a serious ruler. Successful kings do not survive by symbolism alone. They survive by building networks of competence and reward. Hatshepsut did that well enough to keep Egypt functioning not for months, but for years. And as the years passed, something extraordinary happened. The abnormal became established. Children grew up knowing Hatshepsut as king. Priests conducted rituals in her royal names. Workers carved her monuments. Officials dated documents to her reign. The longer she ruled, the harder it became to imagine removing her without tearing at the fabric of the state itself. That is the true measure of her success. Not merely that she claimed the throne, but that she made the claim durable. Still, beneath the brilliance of her reign, one tension never fully disappeared. Thutmose III, the boy on whose behalf she had once ruled, was still there, still alive, still growing, still officially part of the royal order. He was not erased. He was not killed. In inscriptions, his name continued to appear alongside hers in certain contexts. He was, in theory, her co-ruler. But theory and reality are not always the same. As Hatshepsut's authority expanded, the balance between them must have become more complicated. What did the young Thutmose think as he matured under the shadow of a woman who had taken the full symbols of kingship? Was he patient, frustrated, resentful, calculating? The sources do not give us his private thoughts. They give us only silence. And silence in ancient history can feel louder than speech. What we do know is that he eventually became one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings. Later generations would remember him as a conqueror, a master of campaigns, a ruler of fierce energy. That future was already growing while Hatshepsut sat on the throne. Every passing year made the question more dangerous. What would happen when the child became a man? Hatshepsut seems to have ruled for around 2 decades, depending on how the years are counted. That is not the lifespan of a political accident. That is a full reign, a reign long enough to reshape monuments, institutions, and memory. But no reign lasts forever. At some point, she died, and with her death, the balance she had maintained began to change. Thutmose III assumed sole control, and here the story turns darker, more mysterious, and far more human. Because sometime after Hatshepsut's death, many of her images and names were attacked. Statues were smashed, reliefs were altered, cartouches were erased. In some places, her figure was replaced. In others, the traces of her kingship were cut away from stone, as if someone were trying to make the world forget that she had ever ruled at all. For generations, this led to a dramatic idea: revenge, the wronged stepson finally striking back. The old king, humiliated for years, wiping out the memory of the woman who stood between him and his throne. It's a powerful image, but history is rarely that simple. Modern scholars have debated the timing and purpose of the erasures. Some evidence suggests the destruction did not begin immediately after Hatshepsut died, which complicates the theory of pure personal hatred. It may have been politically motivated in another sense. An attempt to tidy the succession, to remove the awkward memory of a female king from the official line, and to protect the legitimacy of later rulers by presenting kingship as something passed cleanly from man to man. In other words, Hatshepsut may not have been erased because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. Her reign posed a problem. If one woman had ruled effectively as pharaoh, built monuments, won divine approval, and governed a flourishing Egypt for years, then the old rules looked less eternal than they claimed to be. Future ambition could take inspiration from her. Dynastic narratives could become unstable. The easiest solution was not to debate her legacy, but to bury it, and for a long time, that almost worked. Imagine how powerful an act that is, to command stonecutters to carve away a life, to strike a face from a wall, to remove a name from the chain of rulers. In ancient Egypt, memory was survival. Monuments were not decoration. They were a second life. To destroy someone's image was not merely to insult them. It was to wound their eternity. So the attack on Hatshepsut's memory was more than politics. It was an assault on immortality. And yet, it failed. Not completely, of course. Much was lost. Many statues were shattered. Many inscriptions were damaged. Her place in later king lists became obscured. But stone is stubborn. Ruins remain. Fragments survive. Archaeologists dig. Scholars compare. A face broken from one temple appears again in another. A cartouche, half erased, still whispers its truth. Slowly, over centuries of modern discovery, Hatshepsut stepped back out of the shadows where ancient power had tried to bury her. What emerged was not the caricature of a usurper barely holding on, but the portrait of one of Egypt's most capable rulers. That matters, because the way history remembers women in power is often distorted. Men who seize authority are called ambitious, decisive, formidable. Women who do the same are more easily called manipulative, unnatural, dangerous. Hatshepsut has suffered from all of those judgments at different times. Her adoption of male imagery confused early interpreters. Her rise through regency invited suspicion. Her relationship with Senenmut invited gossip. Her later erasure seemed to confirm for some that she must have crossed a line too far. But look at the results. Egypt was stable. Its economy flourished. Its monuments expanded. Its religious institutions were funded. Its prestige reached abroad. Its administration functioned. Its legacy endured in stone so magnificent that even the people who tried to erase her could not fully destroy it. How many kings can say the same? This is why the title fits her so well. The woman who ruled Egypt better than most kings. Not because she was perfect, not because every question about her reign is answered, not because she fought the most battles or left the largest empire, but because she mastered the harder art of power, making a system serve her while convincing that system she belonged at its center all along. That requires a rare kind of brilliance. It requires nerve, because at any point the gamble could have failed. It requires discipline, because she could not simply lash out at tradition. She had to reshape it from within. It requires vision, because monuments, theology, trade, and public image all had to reinforce one another. And it requires patience, because the strongest revolutions are often the ones that do not look like revolutions at first. Hatshepsut understood all of that. She knew when to appear as royal wife. She knew when to act as regent. She knew when to step into the language of kingship. She knew when to let the gods speak for her. She knew when to make the kingdom rich. She knew when to build so magnificently that stone itself would argue on her behalf. That is not luck. That is strategy. And maybe the most remarkable part of all is this: she did it inside one of the oldest and most tradition-bound civilizations on Earth. This was not a modern state experimenting with new ideas. This was ancient Egypt, a civilization that anchored legitimacy in ancestry, ritual, divine order, and symbols repeated for centuries. For Hatshepsut to rise there and to rule successfully there means she did not merely break rules. She understood them more deeply than many of the men around her. She saw where tradition was rigid and where it could bend. She saw that authority needed sacred language. She saw that people accept what benefits them. She saw that monuments can outlast rumor. She saw that prosperity can silence outrage. She saw that if you control the image of power, you can control power itself. In that sense, Hatshepsut was not only a ruler, she was a master of political reality. And still, for all her brilliance, there is something tragic about her story. Perhaps it is because she won and was still nearly erased. Perhaps it is because the very state she strengthened later tried to deny what she had done. Perhaps it is because we can feel the loneliness built into her achievement. To stand where no one expects you to stand, to wear the symbols of an office designed for someone else, to hold an empire together while knowing your right to rule will always be questioned more harshly than any man's. That is a heavy burden, even in triumph. Maybe that is why her monuments feel so deliberate, so determined. They are not careless celebrations. They are declarations. They seem to say over and over, I was here, I ruled, I built, I belonged, and she did. When people think of ancient Egypt, they often jump to names wrapped in myth and spectacle. Tutankhamun with his golden mask, Ramses the Great with his colossal ego, Cleopatra with the drama of Rome at her side. Hatshepsut deserves to stand among them, not as a curiosity, not as an exception placed in a corner, but as one of the central figures in the story of pharaonic power. Because she proved something history has had to relearn again and again. The ability to rule does not belong to one gender, one image, or one tradition. It belongs to those who can command belief, deliver stability, and shape the future before their enemies understand what is happening. Hatshepsut did exactly that. She took a regency and turned it into kingship. She took doubt and turned it into ceremony. She took symbolism and turned it into law. She took architecture and turned it into memory. She took a throne built for men and sat on it so firmly that the kingdom prospered. That is power, and that is why, thousands of years later, her story still feels so sharp, so modern, so alive. It is not only the story of ancient Egypt, it is the story of legitimacy, image, ambition, and the dangerous question that echoes through every age. Who gets to rule, and who decides? For Hatshepsut, the answer was not given freely. She built it, carefully, publicly, brilliantly. Then others tried to tear it away. But the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri still rise over the Nile. Her obelisks still catch the light. Fragments of her statues still endure. Her name, once attacked, is spoken again. And the woman they tried to erase now stands larger with every generation that rediscovers her. Not because she was a symbol first, but because she was a ruler first. A ruler who understood that kingdoms are not held by force alone. They are held by stories, by ceremonies, by wealth, by fear, by beauty, by faith, by timing, by the ability to make people see order where, only years before, they would have seen the unthinkable. Hatshepsut mastered that art. She was bold without appearing reckless, sacred without surrendering control, traditional while quietly transforming tradition, peaceful in image, yet imperial in effect. And when we measure rulers not only by battles won, but by states strengthened, prosperity expanded, and legacies built, she ranks astonishingly high. So the next time the ancient world is described as a place where power always wore a man's face, remember Hatshepsut. Remember the daughter of a king who learned how power really worked. Remember the queen who stepped into a regency and refused to disappear. Remember the pharaoh who dressed in the symbols of kingship, spoke in the language of the gods, and built monuments grand enough to outlive her enemies. Remember the ruler whose greatest victory was not simply taking the throne, but making Egypt flourish while she held it. Because in the end, that is the hardest thing any king can do, and she did it better than most.